From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And here's what's ahead. K-State's Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz with a look at chloride as an unheralded but important field crop nutrient that you producers should be accounting for. He'll talk about application rate recommendations and crop response to various chloride fertilizer sources. He'll be followed by K-State's Gregg Ibendahl on forecasting nitrogen fertilizer price trends for the growing season ahead, which he says will take their cues from oil and corn price trends. You producers can use this information when planning your nitrogen purchases. Further ahead, K-State's Charlie Lee talking about the expanding range of the Pileated Woodpecker in Kansas and the tree damage this large bird can inflict. All this and more next on Agriculture Today.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128 plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Good to have you aboard for this Agriculture Today. On this segment, a look at another principle of crop fertility management, one that doesn't get nearly the attention that some of our other nutrient applications do, and that is applying chloride to a crop field. Joining us now is Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz, Nutrient Management Specialist, K-State Research and Extension, and there is, in fact, an extension publication on this topic, which indicates to us, Dorivar, that this can be an important element in crop productivity, you say.
Yes, Eric. This is a nutrient that we do have a fair amount of research in Kansas, especially on winter wheat, corn, and sorghum. Because of soil conditions, especially in central and western Kansas, where we don't have a history of potassium chloride application because of high testing potassium levels, and we do have enough leaching, we tend to have some deficiency issues and potentially some significant yield response for chloride application.
As far as the crop physiology goes, what does chloride do for a crop plant?
Yes, chloride has a key function in terms of maintaining the hydration of the cell in the plant. So that's one of the key functions of this nutrient. And we also tend to see it very closely related to disease suppression in some level. And so oftentimes when we have some level of disease pressure, chloride nutrition becomes very relevant. And again, that's one of the factors that can contribute to chloride deficiency or response to chloride fertilizer application. Again, both the supply from the soil, but also at some level the potential disease pressure that we may have that particular year.
So a chloride deficiency, is it easy to spot in the field? How does it present itself in the plant?
Yes, it has some deficiency symptoms that sometimes mimic a little bit some fungal disease, and for that reason sometimes it's not easy to notice. Sometimes it can be confused by other just fungal disease issues in the field. And the other aspect is that deficiency symptoms may not always be noticeable in some crops and varieties, because we also do have some differences in terms of variety response to chloride application. So it's not necessarily a deficiency symptom that can easily be identified in the field, like other nutrients that generate some chlorosis problems, some yellowing. We don't see that necessarily in chloride. So that could be a challenge. So we really need to be looking very closely and monitoring soil test levels, and when specifically looking at that profile nutrient level, because chloride is a mobile nutrient, which means it's going to move in the soil profile. So just collecting the surface may not give us the whole information. We really need to look at the ideally up to 24 inches profile. And again, we want to monitor that very closely. The deficiency symptoms, like I say, in some cases could be visual, but may not be always that way.
So we're talking about this this with the notion that if chloride is deficient enough, it will make a difference in yields to the point where an application would be economically sensible.
Yes, and talking a little bit about crops, the main crops that typically will be potentially responsive to chloride is going to be winter wheat is on top of the list, but then corn and sorghum are potentially also crops that will respond. The grass species, basically. We have done some studies in soybeans, and we haven't seen really any benefit in other crops like soybean. So again, in terms of yield response, we can see some significant yield increases that could be economical. The other aspect in terms of application rates, typically is a nutrient that we won't need to apply in high rates. The highest rate that where we typically still see a yield response is about 20 pounds of chloride. And most of the yield benefit usually come from the first 10 pounds or so of application rate.
All right. So it is worth one's while to look into this. And as far as the sampling procedure, like you said, the 2-foot sample, 24 inches, and other than that, just the normal routine as far as taking cores out there.
Yes. And again, it is very important to keep in mind that it needs to be a profile sampling because of the mobility of the nutrient. And there are also many aspects to keep in mind because, again, of the nature of the nutrient in terms of mobility. Sometimes if we go very far west in western Kansas, we may not see a response every year because we may not have the level of leaching of chloride that we do see as we get closer to central Kansas. And so if we think about the geography in Kansas, we'll tend to see a lot more frequent response if we are in central Kansas compared to farther west in the state. And of course, in eastern Kansas, we have a history of potassium chloride application. So producers putting some potassium at some point typically will tend to put plenty of potassium with the potash application.
There's one thing you note in an article on this topic in the recent Agronomy E-Update, though, that those physical symptoms of deficiency, they can be somewhat irregular in the field, so that makes it even more difficult to analyze this without actually conducting a soil test.
Yes, and that's another aspect of trying to identify the deficiency in the field. Like I say, we have the visual symptoms are not very evident for the most part, and then the variability within the field is another component. So those are clearly some challenges. So soil test is a key diagnostic tool, but actually tissue analysis also works very well for chloride, and this is something that we should consider, especially thinking ahead if we start to see some lower chloride values is something that we may think about including in the program for the future. And so that's one aspect that we'll definitely have to consider.
In fact, there's been research to indicate that leaf chloride concentrations, if you get a read on that can really tell you something about the overall deficiency of chloride.
Absolutely. That's definitely, again, perhaps will be the best way to identify this deficiency because, again, the visual symptoms are not always easy to find.
So, Dorivar, if a field is deemed deficient in chloride, fertilizer considerations here, and there are several selections that one can look at.
Yes, and again, we already touched a little bit on potassium chloride, which is, again, for easy calculation, we can basically assume that it's 50% chloride. So again, for basically every pound that you're putting of potassium will basically put in the same amount of chloride. So that could be a significant amount of chloride for eastern Kansas where we are putting typically some potassium chloride fertilizer, potash. But then in terms of other sources, especially if we're thinking about top dressing, for example, with liquids, we do have many options in terms of liquid sources of chloride, magnesium chloride, calcium chloride. Those are very typical available options. And again, it really depends on where we are in the state. Typically, dry potassium chloride is not as available sometimes in western Kansas, but again, that's where we tend to find more of the liquid chloride options for application. In terms of efficiency and availability of these different sources, we have a lot of data in Kansas that shows that they are all equivalent and they are all highly available in terms of solubility. Both the dry and liquid options are highly available, so that gives us a lot of flexibility in terms of application time. Many producers may be considering doing application pre-plan or in the fall, but again, for example, if we're talking about we can easily do top dressing time and basically get the same benefit. Same thing for other crops, corn and sorghum. If we do even citrus applications, again, because of the mobility of the nutrient, we see that response pretty quickly.
But again, those sources are equal in their performance and the response to those applications, so one can look for the best bargains out there in effect.
Absolutely, and I think that's really the key here in terms of because of the availability of those nutrients to the plant are similar agronomically, then we really need to be looking at what we can get in the region and, of course, the price and what would make more sense from that standpoint.
Well, this is something that producers probably need to pay more attention to. There are a number of laboratories that offer a chloride test, you say, including K-State.
Yes, K-State will offer a chloride test, and it typically will be a test that can be done with other mobile nutrients, with nitrogen and sulfur. Again, those are the main three mobile nutrients that could be a concern in some of our fields. And so typically, if we are collecting that profile sample, I think is ideally, we want to analyze also for nitrogen, for sulfur, and as well as chloride.
And there is a K-State Research and Extension publication on this topic. It is entitled Chloride in Kansas, Plant, Soil, and Fertilizer Considerations. You can go to the K-State Research and Extension bookstore online to access that. And Dorivar, we'll have you back soon for, you say, as you've been on the meeting circuit lately, concerns are rising among producers about fertilizer applications to crop ground as our soils remain persistently wet and potentially will be so for a while.
Yes, that's definitely a challenge this year in terms of fertilizer. I think it's pretty clear here in Kansas, but actually I hear that from other colleagues in other states. The application of anhydrous last fall has been very limited, and of course thinking ahead of this spring and wet conditions, that's a big challenge in terms of looking at perhaps other options for nitrogen application.
Mm-hmm. That's going to be something to keep a very close eye on as we move forward. Dorivar, it's always a pleasure to have you over. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
On chloride applications to crop ground and where those might pay off, as well as the product selections, rates, and the depth of sampling that you'll need to consider to carry that project out correctly. That's Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz. He's a crop nutrient specialist with K-State Research and Extension. This break now, and when we come back, more on crop fertilizer management, this time on the economic side, and just what you can expect in the way of fertilizer costs this growing season ahead. That's next here on Agriculture Today. Agricultural producers, landowners, and creditors, you have a partner in your legal and financial needs. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services offers reliable, trusted information and guidance. Whether you need advice for ag credit concerns or are transitioning your operation to the next owner, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services can assist you in making sound decisions for your business. To learn more, call 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Agriculture Today is back now on the K-State Radio Network, and as promised, some thoughts for you on where fertilizer prices may be headed for you crop producers here in 2019 and how that's been calculated by our guest. He is Gregg Ibendahl. Gregg is a farm management economist with K-State Research and Extension, as you know. Gregg, there's importance to this for as we go year by year, you note, among the costs that go into crop production, fertilizer is right up there in the top 2 or 3 on a regular basis, isn't it?
Yeah, I would have to think so. I mean, if you look at this is based on KFMA numbers, so I have to thank all the KFMA economists and the farmers who work with them because that's where all our data comes from. But if you look at fertilizer costs as a percent of total crop production costs, it's currently about 15%. It has, it varies depending on what the price of fertilizer is in any given year. I mean, in some years it's been up as high as 25%. In years past, maybe out west where they don't necessarily use as much fertilizer, it's down to 10%. But still, 15 or so percent, that's a fairly good chunk of money for anyone to allocate toward one expense type like fertilizer is.
That's a general statement you point out in the write-up on this topic, that this will vary from one end of the state to the other, will it not?
Yeah, I mean, usually better soils and we can farm more intensively on the eastern part of the state. You're probably going to use more fertilizer than you do out west, so some of those weather-related things go along with fertilizer use too.
So, over time now, do fertilizer costs tend to vary quite a bit? You have some records that hint at that, anyway.
Yeah, actually they do. And again, as I'll talk about here in a bit, fertilizer is highly tied to the price of oil. So whenever we have high oil prices, fertilizer prices tend to match. But again, I have a chart in my paper kind of looking at the historical cost, and I've adjusted those so everything's in current dollars. But I mean, back during most of the 90s, early 2000s, our fertilizer costs probably averaged on a per acre basis about $25 to $30 per acre. It got as high as like $80 around 2012. And currently across the state, from the eastern side of the state, it's about $50 per acre. To the west, it's about $30 per acre. So, it's a pretty good chunk of money most farmers are talking about to cover fertilizer expenses.
Again, though, it does tend to follow oil prices, as you say. And even though those costs have declined in recent years, we don't want to lose sight of their importance.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at my graphs I have on here, so I have basically 6 years worth of fertilizer prices. So the initial 3 years, those fertilizer prices were real high. The last couple of years, though, fertilizer prices have been fairly cheap thanks to some fairly low oil prices. Fertilizer prices kind of picked up a lot during the second half of 2018. So now we're kind of at a point where fertilizer prices kind of at a midpoint of like the last 6 years.
Well, then you've come up with a method for calculating what fertilizer prices may be coming down the pipe here in 2019, not only associated with oil prices, but corn prices as well. You might explain that variable.
Yeah, I have seen some earlier work by some other economists looking at nitrogen fertilizer prices, especially anhydrous, looking at that tied to the price of natural gas. And really, you would think that would make sense because we produce all of our anhydrous ammonia basically as a catalytic reaction with the air and burning natural gas. So natural gas is the main ingredient that goes into nitrogen fertilizer. But it turns out that when you start looking at the ability of natural gas to predict anhydrous ammonia prices, it's really not a very good fit. And I think that has to do with the fact that natural gas prices tend to be very volatile, so trying to use that as a prediction model doesn't work too well. Well, as you might guess, oil and natural gas are also kind of very tight substitutes as well. So it really turns out using oil price works out to be a much better predictor, and we can use that as somewhat as a guide for the supply side. And then through some earlier work looking at what's the demand from the driving prices on the demand side, turns out corn is a pretty good model there too. So, whenever we see higher corn prices, you're going to use more fertilizer. If you're planting soybeans, it's not going to use any nitrogen fertilizer. So the price of corn is also a good predictor for the price of anhydrous.
We all know how much of an appetite corn has for nitrogen. Therefore, that's what makes that link so strong. So you can take those variables and put them into a calculating model to predict, well, in this case, anhydrous ammonia prices. That's what you're focusing on here.
Yeah, basically I was using monthly prices for those, and I developed a model basically using the current corn price, and it turns out the oil price is a good predictor, but it's a little far in advance, so we need to lag that. And basically, the price of oil right now is basically going to be a predictor for what's going to happen 9 months in the future for the anhydrous price. So basically, combining those two, the corn price and the oil price, we can come up with a model that really predicts pretty well. I get an R-square of like 0.85, and, 1 would be a perfect fit. So 0.85 is a really strong model for this. You do make a point. There is this lag factor on the oil price side when calculating anhydrous ammonia prices. That's important to keep in mind here. Yeah, it actually makes using the model a little bit easier because we already know what happened with oil prices, so that's not something we have to estimate. Now, the corn price, we do have to make some estimation of what we think futures corn prices might be, but, there's a whole universe out there of people predicting future corn prices. So really the model is pretty easy to use. Again, we go back and look at what happened in the last 9 months or 10 months for oil prices. Oil prices rose quite a bit during the last half of 2018. They have started coming down. We're kind of in the middle of working through that right now with oil prices. So I think we're at the point now with fertilizer prices. We're starting to see some of those high points of 2018 show up in the fertilizer price. But, going forward right now, oil prices have since declined a little bit from what they were at the end of 2018, too. So I think going forward toward the end of the year, I think there's a good chance you're going to see fertilizer prices probably start to go down a little bit. Although in the interim, I think they actually may rise a little bit, maybe short term for the next couple of months. Right. But you're not talking about a precipitous drop, but an easing back on fertilizer prices, perhaps. Yeah, oil prices last year got up to around to the $70 per barrel range. And right now, I think they're like in maybe the mid-50s or so. The Energy Information Association is really not predicting a whole lot of big swing in oil prices. Again, they don't really forecast any shocks. They're kind of looking at more of a steady state than maybe a slight decrease. But we haven't seen those high oil prices work their way all the way through my model here. I think by the time they do get around to the $50 range for oil prices, I think you'll see fertilizer prices decline a little bit anyway. Not a whole lot, but I think farmers will see a little bit easing of fertilizer prices in the last half of 2019.
With that thought in mind, Gregg, how might that influence a producer's fertilizer cost management, do you think, in regard to maximizing on whatever downturn in fertilizer prices might be out there?
Well, I think, before we get to that downturn, I think you're going to see at least steady, maybe even slightly increasing fertilizer prices a little bit for the next couple of months. So I don't know if you haven't bought fertilizer yet, I don't think you're going to say save a whole lot if you need fertilizer for spring by waiting. So now would probably be as good a time as any. Although I think for fall planting, any kind of wheat fertilizer you would need then, I think fertilizer prices will be a little cheaper come wheat planting time. So I wouldn't be in too big a rush to buy your fall fertilizer requirements anytime soon.
So in other words, don't get carried away with advanced pricing on either score, spring crops or winter wheat in the fall.
Yeah, I don't really think so. If you really wanted to find better prices for spring planting, I think that would have happened a while back. Before they started going up in the end of 2018. I think right now, again, it's probably steady to maybe slightly increasing. So I don't really see much difference of when you buy your spring fertilizer price now. Although, like I said, the fall fertilizer could be a different story, though.
Of course, this is just part of the overall cost management picture for the crop producer, that fertilizer investment that one might make. So maybe as producers think about finding ways of economizing as these margins are so tight, they should look elsewhere in their cost portfolio. Herbicide, pesticide investments, fuel costs, which we spoke of not that long ago, other costs of doing business in the crop production sense, those may be where one can make more difference, it sounds.
Yeah, I think so. You kind of need to look at all your expenses individually, then kind of put them all together and see how it makes up the whole and combine that with what you think expected prices might be. So, really looking at our budgets would be a good place to go for that kind of thing.
And you have a host of those on the agmanager.info website, including the spreadsheets available for producers to walk their numbers through those, right?
Yeah, we have both irrigated, non-irrigated, the whole range of crops for the different areas of the state. So I think you should be able to find a budget in there that's going to fit your area.
By all means, capitalize on those tools, producers. Make full use of them as you figure out your most economical route to crop production this year. And have a close look at this analysis that Gregg has put together in written form on predicting fertilizer prices. It, too, can be found on that front page of the agmanager.info website. And Gregg, as always, we thank you. We'll have you back soon.
Thanks.
Gregg Ibendahl is a farm management economist with K-State Research and Extension, and he's with us regularly to talk matters of farm cost management here on Agriculture Today. It would be appropriate to let you know as well about another source of information that's found on agmanager.info right now. The Land Use Survey Center at K-State's Department of Agricultural Economics conducts a survey each year as the core part of its mission. And the survey that's just been released out of that center focuses on input costs. It covers the gamut: fertilizer, chemicals, seed costs, custom field operations, and it's broken down by each of the 9 crop reporting districts that the National Agricultural Statistics Service maintains. And it is broken out as well for both irrigated and non-irrigated cropping on 7 crops, including wheat, sorghum, soybeans, corn, alfalfa, sunflowers, cotton. The summary of their survey findings now available to you producers to review and perhaps to use as a benchmark for your own operations. Have a look at this new input cost survey for Kansas crop farms, right there on the front page of agmanager.info. We'll return in a few moments after this break here on the K-State Radio Network.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today here on the K-State Radio Network. Eric Atkinson with you as we check on today's agricultural news headlines now, courtesy in part of GTN. The USDA's National Agricultural Statistics Service has posted its monthly Kansas crop progress and condition report, and to no one's surprise, moisture levels in the state are fairly plenty. The topsoil moisture supplies 40% surplus, 57% adequate, only 3% short to very short, while subsoil moisture is at 24% surplus, 74% adequate, only 2% short to very short. And the USDA's latest read on the winter wheat crop in Kansas, 51% good to excellent, 40% fair, and 9% poor to very poor. The weekly reports on crop progress and condition will begin next week for the 2019 season out of the USDA. The Trump administration wants China to promise to buy a broad range of agricultural commodities, not just soybeans, in the trade negotiation underway, according to Agriculture Deputy Secretary Steve Sinskey. In remarks yesterday, he said that means China should fulfill its commitments under the tariff rate quota system to buy other commodities, also U.S. meat and pet food likewise. The U.S. also expects China to improve its biotechnology approval system, says Sinskey. He said that in the past it's taken a presidential summit to get those biotech approvals. The engagement with China is a tough but promising negotiation, in Sinskey's words. But he also said that achieving a good agreement on agriculture is not enough to win the administration's backing. He said China has to agree to make changes to its system of technology transfer and not force U.S. companies to transfer their technology or to take on a Chinese partner who in effect would steal U.S. knowledge, as he put it. Sinskey also said there's a lot of work ahead to get the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement passed. He said that the USDA is advocating within the administration the removal of tariffs on Mexican and Canadian steel. Agriculture leaders have said the tariffs have led to retaliatory tariffs that have diminished their exports, and that the provisions in the USMCA will be meaningless if the tariffs are not removed. He also noted, did Sinskey, that Larry Kudlow, the director of the White House National Economic Council, has said he expects those tariffs will, in fact, be removed. Well, at last, the USDA's cattle inventory report will be released this week. More on that from the USDA's Gary Crawford.
USDA only does a comprehensive report on the cattle inventory twice a year. The latest one was supposed to be January 31st, but the shutdown postponed that. Now it's finally coming out this Thursday.
I am anxiously waiting. I think the industry analysts are anxiously waiting.
USDA livestock analyst Sheo Shagam told us in this upcoming report, among the bits of new information,
we'll have an idea of the direction of the herd. We will also get an idea of what producer intentions are in terms of retention of heifers for the breeding herd. And again, once we get that number, and we will get the individual breakouts of heifers which are being not kept for breeding, the steers, the calves, what was actually on feed in the U.S., it will help us get a handle on the availability of calves outside feedlots to be placed during 2019.
And a better handle on whether producers are still expanding the herd, reducing it, or keeping numbers steady. The report comes out Thursday, 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Washington.
And that takes us into the weekly feature for you dairy producers from the Animal Sciences and Industry Department here at K-State. Milk Lines with K-State dairy specialist Mike Brook. Mike?
Today I want to visit with our Kansas dairy farmers concerning some of the calls and emails I've seen in the recent weeks. A lot of it centers around what's going on with our transition cows, or those animals that are 2 to 3 weeks pre-fresh. On most of our dairy farms, we do have these animals separated off. They're fed a separate diet, and in many cases that includes some anionic salts. We do this to increase the uptake of calcium from the digestive system, and also to start the metabolic processes that are going to be necessary to mobilize calcium from the bones once the animal starts lactating. In a sense, we're getting her ready for increased calcium demand as she moves into lactation. So as we look at this, we often do a critical test. It's called urine pH. A lot of times on our farms, we select 10 animals from that pen, and we do a urine pH test on them. Typically, we'll drop the high value and the low value, and then we'll take the average of the 8 remaining animals. we should fall between 6.0 and 7.0 pH. This is below the normal pH if they were not being fed anionic salts, and it gives us an idea that the anionic salt diet is truly working, so that we should be able to accomplish the increase in calcium uptake from the digestive system, as well as starting the processes that are required to mobilize calcium from the bone. Essentially, we've set the animal up into a slight acidotic state, and that is the reason why the urine pH is lowered. So, some of the things that we have to consider as we go through all the weather changes and issues that we have seen associated with just environment in the last few months is that intake goes up and down in these pens, many times associated with changes in weather. It's not unusual in this transition pen to find a dry matter intake that might range from as little as 22 pounds up to maybe 32 pounds or more, depending on the animal. So keep in mind that changes on intake will have an impact on the amount of decad that they actually intake, or the amount of anions that they're consuming, as well as cations. This all is going to have an impact on urine pH. See greater variability in intake, we'll generally see greater variability in the urine pH. So the important thing to do is make sure that we do not have too many knee-jerk reactions as we evaluate urine pH. Again, we should stay in that range between 6.0 and 7. However, what if you're just on the outside of that? What if you're just a little above 7, or if you're a little below 6? Well, you might want to do another test in a week just to make sure that it's just not an anomaly caused by some of the fluctuations we see in intake. Also, you might take a look at the animals that you actually selected for the urine pH test. Ideally, we'd like to test animals that have been on the diet at least 7 days and no more than 14 days. If you have animals that fall outside of those ranges, maybe if it's less than 7 days, that they haven't been on the diet long enough to actually lower urine pH, or if they've been on the diet more than 14, we may start to see a slight rise from what their low point was on urine pH. In all of this, we need to make sure that we involve our nutritionist as well, as this has an important impact on whether or not we're seeing the reduction in urine pH as we should when we're feeding these anionic salts. This is Mike Brook with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to carefully analyze urine pH in their pre-fresh cows.
All right, Mike, many thanks, as always, and we'll return in a few moments with more here on Agriculture Today.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State Research and Extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
Now for you on Agriculture Today, more on wildlife management featuring wildlife specialist Charlie Lee of K-State Research and Extension. Charlie, you've more information today on a type of woodpecker that isn't as common as some others in the state and around the nation, but it's starting to draw more attention, the pileated woodpecker.
Yeah, the presence of many woodpecker species is really kind of limited by the availability of trees that are suitable for creating cavities for nesting, foraging, and roosting. The pileated woodpecker is a very large woodpecker, maybe the largest woodpecker that we know of in North America, almost the size of a crow. They have a very distinctive triangular red crest on a mostly black body. Around the neck and the sides of the face, they have some white stripes, and it's white underneath the wings. They fly with the typical undulating behavior of other woodpeckers, as opposed to a straight-line flight of a bird like the crow. Another unique feature of them is the distinctive holes that they create in rotten wood. They're feeding primarily on carpenter ants. They're a very loud bird, and not only their foraging behavior is sounds that are made are quite loud, they also drum on the sides of homes occasionally or other trees that can be heard from quite a distance. And since these are such large woodpeckers, the amount of damage that they do on some trees is unique, and it's pretty impressive for a bird. And many people think that it must be some other species of animal that can create that much damage and that many wood chips, if you will, around the base of the tree. They don't always create holes and burrows clear up to the top of the tree. Sometimes it will be down very close to the soil level. They also will tend to scratch on the side of the bark and scrape the bark and then create those distinctive, almost D-shaped holes in the trunk as they go in to either create nesting or feeding areas.
So this is harmful damage to the tree, potentially, then?
Yes, I think you could consider the amount of damage that pileated woodpeckers do on trees to be damaging to the tree. And in fact, I would guess most timber buyers will not be very interested in buying trees that have been picked on by the pileated woodpecker because they do create a lot of damage, which reduces the value of the tree.
And one would wonder, will they inflict similar damage to wood-sided homes?
Yes, in other states, they create that type of damage in homes. In my experience in Kansas, I've not seen pileated woodpeckers do damage on the side of homes. I've seen that in reports from other states, and the damage is pretty significant. We do occasionally have woodpeckers that damage homes in Kansas, and typically the prevention techniques would be very similar. You try to scare them away with frightening devices. Those may be something immovable like aluminum pans or wind socks, perhaps rubber snakes or decoys or noisemakers. Use of nets on areas that they're damaging, hanging down from the eaves is probably the more permanent technique, but there's no sure way to keep woodpeckers off of the side of your home. When we're talking about a species that seems to be on the increase in Kansas, we have to try to think about what habitat conditions are being created that is going to allow them to start to expand their range in Kansas. Historically, the range was kind of restricted to the southeast part of the state, but there are now reports of pileated woodpeckers expanding their range north and westward.
You say up to recently there's been little research conducted on the pileated woodpecker, although there is a new study that may shed some light on its home range.
Yes, there was a study recently done in Seattle, Washington that was just reported on, and it really looked at the use of habitat in urban areas versus suburban areas by the pileated woodpecker. Some of the conclusions from that research, they looked at the home range. The home range is about 400 to 600 acres for the pileated woodpecker in the urban areas, and it's much larger off of the urban areas. They thought that if it was less than 20% of forested area, they considered that highly urbanized, and pileated woodpeckers were not as likely to use that as they would in some of the more rural areas where they had a higher percentage of woodland areas. They really like forest cover above 20%, and retaining large deciduous trees and snags in public green spaces and yards is going to improve the habitat suitability for woodpeckers and also help create that biodiversity that they facilitate. So although at times some folks could consider them a damaging critter, they also create homes and trees for other species to use. Also, it's very interesting to see the amount of damage that they can create on a tree. It's just very impressive to see that many wood chips come out of a tree that's relatively large for a woodpecker, but you think the damage could be caused by other animals just based on the amount of damage that's done to the tree.
So last thought here relating to Kansas, yes, it's found in limited numbers, but if we continue to see more accelerated reforestation of rural areas, that might provide new habitat opportunities for this bird.
Yes, I think the increasing size and growth on area occupied by woodland species in Kansas is probably doing something to facilitate the spread and expansion of the range of the pileated woodpeckers. We're now seeing trees start to mature. We know that they like trees that are greater than 12 inches to 15 inches in diameter. As trees mature across the state, our riparian areas seem to be doing better. As those mature, I think we can continue to see pileated woodpecker habitat range expand.
Again, it's called the pileated woodpecker, considerably larger in size than the common woodpecker that we see here in Kansas. We appreciate the background, Charlie. As always, many thanks. Along with us each week, wildlife specialist Charlie Lee, K-State Research and Extension, right here. That caps off this Tuesday edition. Remember to listen to the podcast version of our broadcast. Go to agtoday.net. Just tap the subscribe button there, and brand new episodes of our program will arrive automatically on your device every weekday. It's a great way to keep up with what we have to offer here, so check it out at agtoday.net. Meantime, please be back with us right here this same time tomorrow, won't you? Until then, Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.